Peter Cook here on the Hill with House Ways and Means Chairman Dave Camp, the Republican from Michigan. First of all, thank you for the time. Appreciate you joining us here on Bloomberg.
Good to be with you.
You are bringing to the floor next week a piece of legislation you don't support, an increase in the debt ceiling with no strings attached. Tell me why you're doing this.
Well, I think it's important to try to move this debate forward, and there are a lot of people who are still clinging to this idea that somehow the debt limit's going to be raised without this kind of structural reforms and spending cuts that we need. So I think it's important to demonstrate that that avenue is closed, and I think that'll clear some air, and we can really get to a serious discussion about how we're going to reduce our debt, reduce our deficit, reduce spending, and really get the kinds of reforms so we can really keep us from having this problem get worse and hopefully make it better.
You know, there are a lot of folks out there around the world watching the situation closely. Financial markets, they'll see that Bloomberg headline, House doesn't approve debt ceiling increase. Are you worried about the market reaction?
Well, this is one where I think we have to look past just the headline and how can we actually get to a resolution of this issue that really brings us a kind of structural reform that we need. And I think that's going to be very important to do. And as I said, there are still people who think that somehow, magically, there's going to be a vote that will raise the debt limit without the kinds of... I think that would actually be worse. I think that would actually cause markets to react worse if the message went around the world that the United States really isn't serious about getting their debt problem under control.
There are reports you've been reaching out to some of the folks on Wall Street to try and reassure them.
Well, absolutely, just to explain what it is we're doing on the Hill. And sometimes, you know, the best position between 2 points is not a straight line, and this we're going to have to take a little bend before we get to the end result.
What about the Biden talks? What's your own sense? I know you're not in the room, you're not part of the negotiations, but what are you hearing back from the Majority Leader Eric Cantor about how it's going and whether or not this is something you all can support?
Well, having served on the Debt Commission that actually issued a report that really laid a path forward how we can address the debt, we know what needs to be done. Now we need to really bring together both parties to implement what we all know needs to be done. We need to have serious entitlement reform. We need to reduce spending because, as you know, the mandatory or entitlement spending is about 2/3 of the budget. So you really can't get there from here without those kinds of reforms. Obviously, that's something that has to be part of any proposal.
You didn't mention, of course, taxes, the revenue side of the equation. We heard from Senator Coburn again this week, other Republicans who have said, listen, we have to acknowledge that revenue has to be included somewhere. Could you see yourself supporting, at the end of the day, any plan that lowers taxes, lowers individual tax rates, for example, but gets rid of some of those deductions and breaks, and at the end of the day, potentially raises revenue?
Well, you don't want to hit those small businesses who we're going to depend on to hire the people to create the jobs that we need to have. And every tax proposal really hits those small business owners that we're going to need to really be creating jobs for us. So I think that would be a mistake. I also think that we have to demonstrate a commitment to getting our debt and deficit under control. The problem is Washington has spent too much. We need to address that spending problem. I don't believe we have the credibility to go to the American people and say, you know, you need to be paying more. You just haven't been paying enough, when the real problem's been Washington's been spending too much.
You're the point man on taxes for House Republicans. Explain to us where the compromise, where the middle ground is here. What is it the rest of us aren't looking at that can bridge the divide between Democrats who say, listen, revenue has to be on the table, and you all saying it absolutely can't be on the table? Is there something in the middle? Well,
what we really need is revenue-neutral tax reform that doesn't make it part of this debt discussion. I think to put taxes on the table now would be a mistake, but revenue-neutral tax reform, which actually would grow our economy and under estimates could create 1 million jobs in the first year alone. And if we could get to a lower rate, but revenue neutral, closing off all of the exceptions and provisions that have been put into the code over the last decade, and finding a way to have a really more transparent, effective tax rate at a lower level, but again, revenue neutral. I think that's the direction that will help actually grow our economy. And so it isn't about taxing or spending or cutting completely. It is also about that growth piece. That's the tax discussion we should be having. Can you see eye to eye with Secretary Geithner on corporate tax reform in particular? Because it sure sounds like if you listen to the two of you, you're not that far apart. Well, we're obviously talking about these issues, and I think this is something we should do. But again, I think we have to do both corporate and individual, because so many pass-through entities are organized now in the United States. So you would not hit as much of the economy as we need to with just corporate. But certainly we need to reform our corporate and business taxes. We're not competitive. It's really too complex. But we also have to make sure that all the pass-through entities have the same sort of benefits. And I think that would be very important. Let me ask you one final question. Are you all prepared to potentially bear the blame if there is a default at the end of the day, there's no deal? Well, look, I think the administration has to really put their ideas on the table in terms of what they expect to see in terms of debt reduction. Like I said, if we were not to do anything to address our debt, I think the markets would react worse because I think that would say that the United States isn't serious, and I think that could have really significant ramifications throughout our economy.
Chairman Kent, thank you for the time. Appreciate
Thanks,
you joining
Peter.
us here on Bloomberg.